pandemic?
Yes, good morning, Ayanda, and Merry Christmas to you, your team, and to all your viewers. It is a very different Christmas, and I think that it has, if one had to use the language of a satellite guide, this has caused the churches to recalculate altogether. I think that we've had to rethink things really from Easter time, and a lot of churches were worried about this Christmas period and what would happen. But on the other hand, I also say I think there's the reflections have led us also to look back into the traditions of the church and into our history. If one looks at the early church started in households. And I think one of the things that a lot of church communities have done is they have the online church services, but they've encouraged people to gather in those households again. I mean, Christianity didn't start in churches. It started in households. We didn't have these massive big buildings. We didn't have huge gatherings. It was families that came together, neighbors who came together. And so we're encouraging people to do that, to come together in ways in their family units or wherever they find themselves, and to pray together, to reflect together in those units. I think the other thing is, theologically speaking, one suddenly realizes how much of the Christmas story has to do with the situation we find ourselves in at the moment. Mary and Joseph go to Bethlehem. Their life takes a curve that they were not expecting. The unexpected happens to them. They are nervous. They are anxious about the future. I think that if one looks at the story of them having to find a place for her to give birth in a stable or in a cave, there was social isolation there. They were alienated from people. I think that if one looks at them having to flee because of Herod and what happened there, they had to leave the way of life that they were familiar with, and they had to embrace a new way of life in a foreign country. And at the moment, we're trying to embrace a new way of life in a very foreign time, where something that is core to our humanity, being with others, socializing, communicating, is something that we've been asked not to do. I mean, that is very foreign, and we have to find a way of dwelling in that space as they had to find a way of living in Egypt, of living in exile.
Yeah. Now, for better or for worse, Father Pollitt, the wheels of change in the church typically turn quite slowly. I wonder, as we continue adjusting to, I guess, the difference that is brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic, whether there's even scope for a change in some of the, call it, rituals that are observed in the church. For instance, for a Sunday is a day of obligation, but I've got reason to believe not many Catholics specifically are observing that day, and perhaps rightly so, because they need to keep safe. But also, typically when you walk into any church, there's the tradition of, dipping your finger into a bowl of holy water and genuflecting before the altar. That's just another way through which, one can spread any disease really, and not just COVID-19. Mm. Do you imagine a situation where the church starts rethinking things like that and, moving forward in a way that at least prohibits the risks that we're now learning those rituals can bring to people's celebrations?
Absolutely. And I think that's already been happening. Once again, I think Easter was almost the forerunner of this. Mm. So the Catholic Church, for example, from before Easter, the bishops have said there may not be holy water at the entrances of churches because when churches reopened, actually, after the hard lockdown, there may not be holy water. The distribution of communion has completely changed. People used to share in the cup and in the bread. Now people are still sharing in the bread, but there's no touching of that bread. So I think that the situation has forced the church to change rather rapidly and to rethink a number of rituals, even things like weddings and funerals, baptisms. There's been a number of guidelines by the bishops here in South Africa, so to mitigate the transmission of COVID and to say this is now how we do it. You talk about the Sunday obligation. I'm not sure ever, in recent history, if this has happened. But the Catholic Church almost throughout the world, but yeah, especially in South Africa, the bishops have taken away that Sunday obligation. And they've said to people, you're not obliged to attend a mass on a Sunday if you are worried about COVID, if you're worried about the pandemic. But what you need to do is find an alternative. So, pray at home or join an online mass or something like that. So even that obligation has been lifted by the authorities of the church, which is something which surprised many people that they would do, because this is something that was very, very strong in Catholicism, the idea that, Sunday is a day of the Lord and you go to church. So we've seen these changes happen, and obviously they're not natural changes. They're not the changes that the church would want to have made. And yet the situation is forcing us to say, we actually have to do this. It can't be done any other way, because ultimately we have to protect life. The greatest gift that each one of us is given is life, and therefore we have to do everything we can to protect life. And if that means putting all these things in place, we have to do that. I know, for example, in the Archdiocese of Durban, a letter went out yesterday. There's 9 communities that have been very badly affected by COVID-19, and the Cardinal has said, please shut those churches immediately. I want nothing to happen at Christmas because of the protection of life. I mean, this is unheard of. This is not how the church is. We're closing our doors to protect people.
And it feels a bit counterintuitive, doesn't it? But more so, it is something that a lot of, call it, purists are likely to push back against, right? In any organization, there are people who feel, certain identities ought not to be diluted under any circumstance, which creates quite a complex situation for someone like the Pope, whose job obviously is to ensure that there's some kind of unified force within the church. How best do you think he can navigate something like that?
Yeah, that's a very complex question. You're right. And there has been pushback. And some people, on the one extreme, people are saying, it's absolutely ridiculous for the churches to expect people to gather. We need to find other ways. On the other extreme, people are saying, we need to trust in God and nothing will happen if we trust in God. Well, that position is also very, very silly, because God gives us a brain to think. And if we see that, bringing people together and gathering is something that's going to, potentially cause harm to them and others. I mean, we have to also say our trust in God means also trusting in those whom God has given the gift of science to, that understand this and can advise us on this. So I think it is very difficult for the Pope. But what he's done is he has obviously put protocols in place in the Vatican, and they're being very strict about what he does and his public appearances, and when he does appear publicly, the social distancing and so on and so on. But the Pope has said, I don't know what's happening in every single place in the world, and therefore I need to use the bishops in the different parts of the world who know the situation on the ground, and I trust that the bishops in different parts of the world will be using their discretion and their discernment and their pastoral care of people to make decisions about gatherings, about churches being open, etc., etc. So what he's done is really use the principle of subsidiarity to say, look, you need to make decisions based on your local context, because you are the sign of my presence. You are the head of the church in a specific diocese or country, and so forth. And so that's what Pope Francis has done. And therefore, we even see in South Africa that some bishops have made much stronger, like I mentioned Durban earlier, have made much stronger rulings than other places in the country that are not as affected by COVID yet. And so the bishops too, in their different jurisdictions, are having to make these really tough decisions. And for people who say this is crazy, we should keep churches open, that God will protect us, I mean, we really have to challenge that kind of thought with a rational argument here. And also using parts of our tradition, like moral theology, which tells us we need to protect life, which tells us that the highest gift we have is life, and therefore we need to make decisions that ensure that ultimately life is the most important thing.
Right. I'm also interested to get your thoughts on what you think this moment has meant for the church. I mean, I think it would be disillusioned to believe this is perhaps the toughest thing the church has ever had to face, considering how long it's been around. Or perhaps it gets into the top 5 or something like that. But, broadly speaking, how do we make sense of, for instance, the impact this is likely to have on the popularity of the church? One almost gets a sense that things like evangelization and any kind of mission work that the church would usually undertake to, in part, promote its own sustainability, has been, massively affected by what's been happening over the past few months.
Ayanda, you're absolutely right. I think maybe the image to use is to say that the rug has really been pulled out from underneath the church. The church has been really badly affected by this. And you're right too to say, if one looks back in history, I mean, the church has been through a number of plagues before. It's been affected by those plagues before, when sometimes half the population of Europe was affected by those plagues. We've also had the big crisis of the Reformation, where the church split. So the church has been through a number of crises. I think that the difference with this one is that we are globally aware of it. If one thinks back to other crises the church has faced, because of the lack of the technology we have today, maybe people weren't aware of just how deep this crisis is. This crisis has really struck at the heart of the church. So I think it has had a massive effect. How we are going to negotiate this going forward is a good question. Are people going to return to church? I mean, I had a conversation with someone who's 70 years old, who basically all her life has never missed church, who said to me recently, I don't think I'm going to go back to church. And I said, why? I'm interested. And she said to me, no, I don't want to make a confession. I said, no, I'm not asking you for confession. I'm interested to know. And she said to me, I noticed that whether I go or whether I'm not sure what difference this is making. So I think it's also forcing people to reprioritize. It's forcing people to rethink things. And you're right, it's having an impact on evangelization, on the church's ability to get its message out. I think it's forcing the church to think much more creatively than what it has in the past. But I also think it's forcing the church to think about its place in the world and society at the moment, and what message it's offering. Because if people were desperately hungry, they would be returning. They would be doing what they can. When you see that less and less people across the Christian churches are returning, we need to be asking ourselves, what else is going on here? It's not just about COVID. There must be something else that's going on. So I think it's also what would one say? It's highlighted an inner struggle in the church as well. It's not just the outer struggle of COVID and how to deal with the situation. I think in many churches it's highlighted the inner struggle. You mentioned things like sustainability. That is absolutely true. So I think we're in a very tough time.
Absolutely. And I hope this doesn't come across as insensitive, but one of the issues that have stood out as a potential point of weakness, particularly for the Catholic Church, is the age of some of the cardinals, and specifically the Pope. And because of how this virus works, we know that literally a good portion of the authority in the Vatican immediately count as being at risk of, severe illness if there were to be an outbreak in the Vatican. I wonder what that means for, call it the rise through the ranks in the church, so to speak, because it certainly put the institution at an incredibly vulnerable position, again, because of what we know about how COVID reacts in the body.
You're right. And I think that, when one looks at even just the amount of priests or clergy who have lost their lives due to COVID, many of them were older men. As it is, we don't have a lot of young men coming into the priesthood. There's shortages across the world. I think that this opens up the door to a whole new conversation about how the church should be rethinking things at this time. We do tend always to have older people in those roles. I mean, the sort of theory is that, the older people have the wisdom of experience, et cetera, et cetera. So we do tend to have a hierarchy that's always much older, but it does highlight a problem. And yet, on the other hand, I know of a priest in the Diocese of Oudtshoorn who passed away, who was merely just in his early 50s. Just the other day, he passed away because of COVID. So it's affecting the clergy, but it is affecting our older clergy more. We've had a number of people in the Vatican who have been infected. I mean, for a while, they couldn't even appoint bishops across the world because the person responsible for that was in quarantine because he had COVID. So it does ask questions about, our leadership. I think it asks questions about the vitality of our leadership. And I think that it is also asking questions about, the kind of structure even that we have in the church. I mean, I was talking to a priest the other day, a colleague of mine, and he was saying he wonders how this whole situation has even challenged the structure of the church and the way that we've structured things, and it has been structured like that for a long time. And is this a moment where we are being called or invited to reconsider the structure of the church, the leadership of the church, the profile of the leadership, et cetera, et cetera? I think that's a massive question. And I think it's one that is coming to the fore much more than what it did 18 months ago.
Father Russel Pollitt, always great getting your insights on these issues. Certainly appreciate your time on the AM Report. Once again, have a Merry Christmas to you and yours, and please do keep safe. Father Russel Pollitt is a priest with the Jesuit Institute of South Africa.